Hello everyone, and welcome to Creepy Comfort. I know many of you use these videos to sleep, so before you slip into dreams, let me know where you're listening from in the comments below. If you're enjoying the content, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now get comfortable and relax, and let's begin. It was the kind of house that always felt like it was waiting for something. The creaky wooden floors, the old wallpaper peeling at the edges, the faint smell of must and decay that lingered even in the brightest of days. The kind of house that made you feel as if you were being watched, no matter how empty it seemed. But none of that prepared me for the attic. I'd only moved into the house a few weeks ago, eager to escape the noise of the city, the constant buzz of traffic and the clamor of crowded streets. The house was old, but not too old. A Victorian-style home, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood. For the most part, it was charming, with its wide windows and the large oak tree in the front yard that shaded the front porch. But there was always something unsettling about it. Something just out of reach, like a whisper you can never quite make out. It wasn't until I decided to explore the attic that I realized what that something was. The attic door was old, the kind that creaked in protest when you tried to open it. I had avoided it for the first few days, not because I was afraid, but because it seemed unnecessary. The rest of the house was so much more inviting, with its cozy rooms and sprawling hallway. But curiosity eventually got the best of me. I needed to know what was up there, tucked away behind that rusted door. The stairs were narrow and steep, worn from years of use. The air grew colder with every step, and I could feel my breath catching in the thick, stagnant atmosphere. When I reached the top, I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the door's brass handle. Something about it felt wrong, like stepping into a room that had been untouched for too long. I took a deep breath and pushed it open. The attic was darker than I expected, despite the faint light filtering in from a small, grimy window. Dust hung in the air like fog, and the floorboards creaked under my weight as I stepped forward. Boxes were stacked in haphazard piles. Some of them collapsed under the weight of forgotten memories. A small, moth-eaten armchair sat in the corner, and a single light bulb dangled from the ceiling, casting a weak, yellow glow over the room. It was the silence that unnerved me the most. Not the normal kind of silence, but one that felt deliberate. I could feel it pressing against me, like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I moved further into the attic, my footsteps echoing too loudly in the confined space. I was about to turn back when I noticed something odd. A wooden chest, half hidden behind a pile of boxes, caught my eye. It was old, covered in a thick layer of dust, but the brass lock on it gleamed faintly in the dim light. It was the kind of chest that should have been forgotten, but there it was, waiting for me. Couldn't resist. I knelt down and reached for the lock, but as my fingers brushed against the cool metal, I felt a chill run up my spine. A low, almost inaudible sound seemed to emanate from within the chest. A soft whisper, like someone murmuring just out of reach. I froze. The whisper grew louder, more distinct, though I couldn't make out the words. My heart started to race, and my breath quickened. I looked around the attic, half expecting to see someone standing in the corner, watching me. But there was no one. The room was empty, save for me and the chest. The whisper grew louder still, filling the space around me, echoing off the walls. It was coming from inside the chest. Couldn't look away. I was drawn to it, as if the sound had somehow anchored me to the spot. Slowly, I unlatched the lock, the sound of it scraping against the metal ringing in my ears like a bell. My hands shook as I lifted the lid. Inside, there was nothing but darkness, a thick, oppressive blackness that seemed to stretch infinitely within the chest. The whispering stopped the moment the lid opened, leaving only the faint scent of something rotten in the air. I stared into the abyss for what felt like an eternity, but there was nothing. No shapes, no figures, just a void that seemed to suck in the light around it. And then something moved. A figure emerged from the darkness, or at least that's what I thought at first. It wasn't a person, no, it was something else. Something I couldn't fully comprehend. It was a shadow, but alive, crawling its way out of the chest, its form shifting and twisting like smoke. The moment it touched the floor, it dissolved into the air, leaving only the cold, empty space around me. I slammed the chest shut, my breath ragged, and backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The room felt suffocating now, the air thick with an invisible presence, like something was watching me. I turned to leave, but the door, the one I had opened moments ago, was no longer there. Instead, there was a wall, a solid barrier of wood that hadn't been there before. I was trapped. The whispering returned, this time louder and more frantic. It was everywhere, in the walls, in the floorboards, in my head. My skin crawled, and panic rose within me like a tidal wave. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the endless, suffocating silence that enveloped me. My hands fumbled against the wall, desperately searching for a way out, but there was nothing. The room was closing in on me, and then I heard it, a voice, low and rasping, just behind me. "You shouldn't have opened it." The voice lingered in the air, its presence far too close for comfort. My entire body stiffened as I slowly turned, a cold sweat dripping down my spine. There, in the corner of the attic, stood a figure, a dark, indistinct shape, barely visible in the dim light. It wasn't a person, not in the conventional sense. It was a shadow, but unlike the one that had emerged from the chest, this one seemed more solid, as if it was made of the very darkness that surrounded us. I couldn't move. My legs felt like lead, and my heart was hammering so violently I thought it might burst. The air was thick with something far worse than dust. It was as if the room itself had absorbed all the fear and dread of years, centuries even, and now it was exhaling it into me. Who are you?" I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. It felt absurd to ask, as if I already knew the answer. The shadow didn't respond at first. It just stood there, watching me with an intensity that sent waves of nausea through my stomach. Then, as if toying with me, it shifted. The darkness around it twisted, writhing like a living thing. Came closer, its form growing more defined, more menacing. "You've freed me," the voice rasped, and this time, I could hear it clearly, even though its source remained a mystery. "Now, you will stay." The words were like ice in my veins. I tried to step backward, but my feet were rooted to the floor, as if the very wood had claimed me, binding me in place. The figure reached out, its limbs elongated, impossibly thin, like tendrils of smoke. It moved toward me with an unnatural slowness, each step deliberate, as though savoring the terror it caused. I could feel its presence closing in on me, suffocating the space between us until it felt like the air itself was choking me. The whispering, that soft, frantic murmur, grew louder once again, and I could swear the walls themselves were pulsating, reacting to the growing tension. Suddenly, the floor beneath me groaned, a deep, guttural sound that echoed throughout the attic. The boards splintered and cracked as something stirred beneath them. I stared down, wide-eyed, as the dark figure in front of me slowly dissolved into the shadows again, leaving me alone with the rising terror. Couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The ground beneath my feet trembled, and with a sickening lurch, the floor gave way. The walls seemed to warp and bend, stretching as if the house itself was alive and hungry. I fell, the darkness swallowing me whole. The last thing I saw before the void claimed me was a pair of eyes, glowing faintly in the blackness, watching me from the depths of the chest. Eyes that had been there all along, waiting for the right moment. It's strange, isn't it? How we always think we're in control of our own fate. We like to believe that we can walk away from fear, that we can close the door on things we don't understand. But the truth is, fear has a way of finding us, even when we think we've escaped it. When I fell, it wasn't into the attic, but into something deeper, something older. I should have known, really, should have felt it when the house started to change, when the shadows grew longer and the whispers came more frequently. It wasn't just the house. It was me. It was my mind. Maybe it was already too late the moment I opened that chest. Maybe that's how it starts. The first touch, the first step into a dark world where the rules are different, where fear isn't just an emotion, but a presence that grows, takes root in your very soul. When I hit the ground, it wasn't soft. It was cold, hard, like stone. But it wasn't the ground I expected to find beneath me. It was the floor of the attic, yes, but it had changed. The walls were no longer just walls. They seemed to pulse with life, their edges warping, bending inward, as if the house itself was a living thing, breathing. And the eyes, those eyes, they were still watching me, from all around, from the shadows, from the cracks in the walls, from the floorboards that groaned under the weight of something unseen. They had been there all along. They weren't just in the chest. They were everywhere. It's when you realize that you're not alone, not truly, that the terror sinks in, you know? When you realize the house has been waiting for you all along. You think you're the visitor, but in truth, the house has been watching you long before you ever stepped through that door. And now it's too late to leave. Now let's move on to something else. Perhaps it's time to give in. Story 2. You may not believe me. You may dismiss it as madness or some fragment of a dream, but that's the problem, isn't it? We only ever question the strange things when they're already too close, when we can't run from them anymore. And that's exactly what happened to me. It was supposed to be a quiet night, a peaceful retreat from the chaos that followed me home. I had just moved into an old, creaky house on the outskirts of town. It had a strange charm about it, the kind you couldn't quite put your finger on, but it was perfect for someone like me. Solitude, silence, the kind of stillness that comes when a house has been empty for too long. At first, it felt comfortable. The walls whispered when the wind blew outside, but that was nothing new. The floorboards groaned with every step, but I welcomed it. It was a house that felt alive, like it had a story to tell. I would often sit in the evenings, sipping tea by the fire, watching the dance of the flames, thinking of the history buried in the walls around me. Little did I know those walls weren't just holding stories. They were holding something else. The first night it happened, I was reading in my favorite chair, a cozy spot by the old stone fireplace. The house creaked and settled around me, as it always did. But then, there was something else. A sound soft, like a sigh, but coming from the walls. Not the wind, not the house settling. It was something deeper, something more deliberate. I paused, setting my book down, my heart racing. The house had always made strange noises, but this felt different. The walls themselves seemed to hum with some unseen energy, and the feeling was unmistakable. It was as if I wasn't alone, as if something was with me, watching me, listening to every movement I made. I tried to dismiss it. I really did. Maybe it was just the house's age, or my mind playing tricks on me. But over the next few days, it continued, subtle at first. A tap like a fingertip brushing against the wall. A whisper barely audible that seemed to come from the very foundation of the house. But the strangest part felt intentional, as if the walls were trying to communicate with me. It wasn't until I started hearing the faint breathing that I couldn't ignore it anymore. It wasn't my own breath. It wasn't the house's creaks. It was something other. It came in slow, deliberate inhalations and exhalations, as though someone or something was trapped in the walls, just on the other side, trying to make its presence known. I froze. I couldn't move. I wanted to run, but something kept me rooted to that spot, in that chair, in that room. I got up the courage to investigate. I traced the sounds, following them through the house, room by room. They led me to a small hallway where the walls were unusually thick. The sounds of breathing became more distinct here, closer, almost as if they were right behind the wall in front of me. I pressed my ear against the cold surface, my breath shallow, waiting for the next sound, the next sign of life. No, not life. Something else. Then I heard it. A slow, deliberate scratching, like nails dragging across wood, followed by a faint clicking noise, like teeth clattering. My heart stopped. I pulled back from the wall, my body trembling uncontrollably. The house, the walls, the very air around me felt suffocating. And just when I thought I might lose my sanity from the sheer tension of it all, I heard a voice, a whisper, this time unmistakably clear. We're not alone here. It didn't come from the walls, nor the ceiling. It came from inside the room. I spun around, my pulse racing, but the room was empty. Nothing but the old, dust-covered furniture, the remnants of forgotten lives. But I could feel them. I could feel eyes watching me. Slowly, I moved toward the window, hoping the fresh air might clear my head, maybe shake off the unsettling feeling that had taken root deep inside me. But as I approached, I froze. There, in the reflection of the window, was something I hadn't noticed before. Eyes, hundreds of them, all around me, staring back at me from the walls, from the ceiling, from the floor. They weren't just reflections. They were real, glowing yellow eyes watching from the corners of the room. I stumbled back, horrified. My breathing grew ragged as I backed away, desperate to escape their gaze. But no matter how much I moved, they followed. They were everywhere. And that's when I realized the eyes had always been there. I had just been too afraid to notice, too wrapped up in my own disbelief, in my own need to feel safe. But I wasn't safe. Not anymore. As the walls seemed to close in on me, the voices returned, louder now, more insistent. They weren't just whispers. They were full sentences, calling my name, begging me to listen. And I knew then that I had crossed a line. There was no turning back. I tried to scream, but the sound never came. My throat was dry, constricted, like something was pressing down on it from the inside. The eyes, countless eyes, seemed to multiply, spreading across every surface of the room. Hidden behind peeling wallpaper, in the cracks of the floorboards, in the twisted reflections in the glass. They weren't just watching me. They were studying me, probing my very soul, like they could see every dark corner of my mind. I stumbled back, trying to run, but the room seemed to stretch before me, expanding, pulling further away with every step. The door, the one I had come through, was no longer visible. It had disappeared, leaving only the eyes and the darkness. They were waiting for me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a house. It wasn't just an old building creaking in the wind. This was a prison, and I was its prisoner. I slammed my fist against the wall, desperate to find the door, to find an escape, but it was futile. The walls responded, not with the cold stone I expected, but with a soft, wet sound, like skin being pressed against flesh. The house was alive. The whispering had grown louder now, no longer coming from the walls but from within my own head. It was as if the house was speaking directly to me. I could hear the voices of everyone who had ever lived in this place, their memories seeping into the very fabric of the walls, speaking through them, to me. We were trapped, just like you. It's too late now. You've heard them. You've seen them. They're part of you now. You're one of us. The words hit me like a storm, and I collapsed to the floor, my mind spinning, the weight of it all pressing in on me from all sides. I could feel the house shift again, its walls breathing with my every movement, pulling me closer into its cold embrace. There was no way out, no place to run. I had heard the house's secrets, and now it owned me. In a moment of desperation, I pressed my hand against the wall where the eyes had gathered, hoping to push them back, to force them to let me go. But as soon as my skin made contact, the eyes blinked, every single one of them at once. I could feel a coldness seep into my hand, spreading up my arm, into my chest. The house's presence filled me, a dark weight pressing into my lungs, making it hard to breathe. I jerked back, but it was too late. The eyes weren't just in the walls anymore. They were inside me, twisting their way into my thoughts. I could hear them, feel them, like 1,000 whispers buzzing in my ears. They were alive, and they were inside me now, carving their place into the very fabric of my being. I could feel myself changing, becoming something else, something that belonged to the house. The floor beneath me shifted, and I fell forward, my hands scraping against the cold wood. When I looked up, I saw something that made my stomach drop, something that made the bile rise in my throat. There, in the center of the room, a shape began to form. It was the same figure I had seen before, the one that had been watching me through the walls, the one that had been waiting. It was tall and featureless, a mass of shadow and shifting shapes. Its form flickered and wavered like smoke caught in the wind, but it wasn't the absence of light. It was something more. It was a manifestation of the house itself. I could see the eyes within it now, hundreds of them, all staring back at me with an unblinking gaze. They were alive, and I knew in that instant that the house had been waiting for me to understand it, to accept it. The figure stepped closer, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. My voice was lost, swallowed by the room, by the house that now owned me. "You're part of us now," the voice whispered, the words oozing from the figure like thick tar. "You'll never leave." And I realized something then, something that chilled me to my very core. I wasn't just trapped in this house. The house was trapped in me. It's funny how quickly you can forget who you are when the walls start whispering to you. You lose track of time in a place like this. What felt like hours may have been mere minutes, or maybe days, but the house doesn't care. It doesn't need time. It only needs you. The eyes, they were everywhere now, but no longer in the walls. They had seeped out, oozed into the corners of my mind. I could feel them in the shadows, in the mirrors, in every reflection of myself. The house had marked me, had branded me with its cold, unrelenting presence. I was no longer just in the house. I was of the house. I couldn't escape the pull. Even when I tried to leave, the door had vanished again. I walked through the halls, trying to find an exit, but the house stretched and contorted, twisting around me like a maze. It had a way of bending reality, forcing me into spaces that didn't make sense. The once familiar walls now felt alien, as though they were shifting with every step I took. But the worst part was that I no longer felt alone. There was something with me, always, watching, listening. I would find myself stopping in the middle of the hallway, suddenly aware that the eyes were on me again. Thousands of them, glowing faintly in the dark corners of the rooms, hidden in the cracks of the wood, peering through the space between the floorboards, always watching. At night, when the house seemed to fall silent, I could hear it, the softest, most familiar sound. Breathing, not my own, not the house's, but a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside the walls. I tried to ignore it at first. I convinced myself it was just the house settling. But then it would come again, louder now, closer. Who was breathing? I could hear the walls shifting, groaning as though something was crawling inside them, moving just out of reach. The air became thick with tension, and I could feel my pulse in my throat. The house didn't just want me to stay, it wanted me to understand it, to become a part of it, a piece of its story. It wasn't until I ventured back into the basement that I realized just how much the house had taken. The air down there was dank, suffocating, and the shadows moved as if they had a mind of their own. There was a chill that sank into my bones as I moved deeper into the darkness, my flashlight cutting through the heavy black. It was there, in the farthest corner, that I found it. A door, hidden behind stacks of old furniture and cobwebs, barely noticeable, as if the house had been keeping it from me. I pushed against it, the wood creaking under my touch, and finally it gave way, revealing a narrow staircase leading further down. I descended slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last, as though the house itself was amplifying every sound I made. And then, at the bottom of the stairs, I saw it. A small, circular room, stone walls slick with moisture. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and on it, an old, dusty mirror. The glass was cracked in places, the edges warped as though something had been pressing against it from the other side. The reflection, though, was what sent chills down my spine. First, it was just me, my face pale and drawn, eyes wide with panic. But then it shifted. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the figure in the mirror moved. Couldn't look away. At first, it was subtle, a shadow moving in the reflection, as though something was standing behind me. I turned quickly, my breath catching in my throat, but the room was empty. Only the cold stone walls surrounded me. When I turned back to the mirror, the shadow was gone, but something else had replaced it. A face, pale and twisted, staring back at me. It wasn't my own. It was something other, something born from the darkness itself. The eyes, it had the same glowing yellow eyes as the ones in the walls. But this face was older, covered in cracks, like the mirror was struggling to contain it. I froze. The face smiled, or at least it seemed to. Its eyes never blinked, never shifted. It only watched me, slowly tilting its head, as though studying me. And that's when I realized this wasn't just a reflection. It wasn't just an image trapped in glass. This was something from the house. I stepped back, the ground beneath me suddenly feeling unsteady. I tried to move, to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was as if the house had claimed them too, binding me to the room, forcing me to stay and watch. And then the voice came again. That whisper, only now it wasn't from the walls or from inside my head. It was coming from the mirror itself. You've seen too much now. The room began to distort, warping around me, the walls stretching outward as the air thickened with a sense of something closing in. Couldn't breathe. My chest felt tight, like the house itself was smothering me. You belong to us now. And just before everything went dark, the reflection in the mirror grinned. The face, so twisted, so grotesque, smiled wider, and I felt my stomach churn. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was the faint sound of a door creaking open, and the unmistakable feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. When I awoke, I was back in the attic. The cold, stifling air wrapped itself around me, heavier than before, as though the house had grown stronger in my absence. The darkness clung to the corners of the room like a shroud, the shadows deeper than I remembered. My body ached, and my head throbbed, but it wasn't just the physical pain that gripped me now. It was something far worse. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The air was thick with something I couldn't name. It felt as though the walls were pressing in on me, suffocating me. The house was watching. It knew I had seen the mirror, had felt its cold touch, and now it wanted something more. I rose slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me, and glanced around. The room, the attic, was just as it had been before. Creaky, dilapidated, filled with forgotten remnants of a past that no longer mattered. But now everything felt different. The dusty furniture, the old boxes stacked high, even the cobwebs in the corners. All of it was alive with a sense of malice, as though the house itself was resentful of my presence. The eyes, they were back, not just in the walls, but in the very air around me. I could feel them, peering from every dark corner, from every sliver of light that filtered through the cracks in the ceiling. Each blink, each twitch of their gaze sent a chill down my spine. "You should leave," a voice whispered, soft and mocking. But you can't, can you? I turned sharply, but there was no one there. No figure, no shadow. Only the same oppressive silence that had clung to the house since the moment I arrived. But the voice, it came from within, from the house itself. I could feel it in my bones. The house wanted me to understand, to accept that there was no escape. The more I tried to resist, the tighter its grip became. I had crossed some invisible line, stepped into something ancient, something far older than the house itself. And now I belonged to it. I could feel the pull, the insistent tug at the very core of my being, urging me to stay, to let go of the need for escape. I staggered forward, my legs trembling beneath me. The house was alive, I knew that now. But it wasn't just an entity, it was a parasitic force, feeding off of those who dared to stay too long. And it had claimed me. In the far corner of the room, something caught my eye, a glimmer of silver, an object half hidden beneath the rubble. I approached cautiously, my hand trembling as I reached out. It was a photograph, its edges yellowed with age. I picked it up, my fingers brushing against the faded paper, and stared at the image. It was a family. Their smiles, once bright, were now distorted by time and decay. The father, standing tall and proud, his eyes unblinking as he gazed directly at the camera. The mother, her face half hidden in shadow, her eyes too wide, too empty. And then the children, two little girls, one with a bow in her hair, her smile too perfect, the other with wide, hollow eyes, staring straight into the camera as if they knew something I didn't. They knew. The moment I touched the photo, a sharp pain shot through my chest, and I gasped, dropping it to the floor. The pain wasn't physical. It was something worse, an invasion. It felt as though the house was pulling at my very soul, threading its fingers through my thoughts, twisting them, and bending them to its will. I staggered back, my heart pounding in my ears. The room seemed to warp, the shadows lengthening, pulling closer. The eyes, they were everywhere again, watching, waiting, couldn't breathe. The walls creaked, the floor groaned, and the whispering returned, louder this time, more insistent. It was no longer just a voice in my head. It was all around me, coming from the walls, the floor, the very air I breathed. You don't belong here. You never did. This house is part of you now, and you are part of it. The whisper was all-consuming, filled my mind, drowning out every other thought, every other sensation. I tried to move, to run, but my feet were glued to the floor. The house was holding me here, trapping me in its unyielding grip. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw something, a figure. It was standing in the doorway, watching me. It wasn't human. It was tall, far too tall, and its body was nothing but shifting darkness, like a shadow cast by something unnatural. But the eyes, those eyes, they were everywhere, in its body, in its face, all staring, watching. And then it spoke, its voice as cold and deep as the grave. "You're ready now." I froze. Ready? For what? The figure stepped forward, its long limbs stretching unnaturally, its presence filling the room with an overpowering sense of dread. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. I could feel it coming closer, closer, and then, suddenly, the world seemed to dissolve. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, they were all gone. The house had swallowed me whole. The world was gone. Everything that had once been solid, familiar, had crumbled into nothingness. No walls, no floor, just an endless abyss, stretching out in all directions, darker than any night. I floated, weightless, suspended in a void that had no beginning and no end. It was as if time itself had folded in on itself. My mind screamed for something, anything, to anchor me, but there was nothing. Nothing but the eyes. I couldn't see them, but I could feel them. Watching, always watching. They pressed in on me from all sides, crawling over my skin, burrowing into my mind, demanding my attention. There were so many of them, hundreds, thousands, maybe more. I couldn't tell where one ended and the next began. But I knew they were all the same. Cold, unblinking, unforgiving. The whispers returned. This time they weren't gentle. They weren't mocking. They were commands, each one urgent, insistent. Embrace it. Become part of us. You are ours now. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but my voice was swallowed by the nothingness. My body, my very sense of self, felt like it was splintering, falling apart, dissolving into the dark. I tried to move, to pull myself free, but it was as if the darkness had no boundaries. It was everywhere, inside me, outside me, and then a flash. A faint, glowing light pierced the void. It was small at first, barely noticeable, but it grew slowly, painfully, until it filled the entire space. The light was familiar. The attic. I was back in the attic. It wasn't the same attic, though. The air was colder, thicker, and the shadows stretched far too long, as if they were alive, moving, whispering to each other. The walls were no longer just walls. They had become part of the house, pulsating with a rhythmic, otherworldly energy. The house itself seemed to breathe. I wasn't alone. The figure, the shadow, was back. It stood at the edge of the room, its eyes glowing in the darkness. But this time it wasn't just watching me. It was waiting, watching me change. I could feel it, the transformation. The whispers turned into something else, something more violent. The house was hungry. It had claimed me, and now it wanted more. It wanted to devour everything that I was, to absorb my very soul. You belong to us. You always have. I stumbled forward, my legs shaking, my mind splitting into 1,000 jagged pieces. I reached out, my hand grazing the wall, but the moment I touched it, something shifted. The walls were no longer walls. They were eyes, hundreds of them, thousands, all staring, all hungry, all waiting. The house was no longer a house. It was a living, breathing entity, and I was becoming part of it. The air grew thick, and the shadows closed in, their tendrils curling around me, suffocating me. I could feel the eyes pressing against my skin, under my fingernails, in my veins. The house was inside me now, and I was inside it. We were one. And then I saw her, the girl, the one from the photograph, the one with the hollow eyes. She stood at the far end of the room, her body pale and translucent, her form flickering in and out of existence like a fading memory. Her eyes, those eyes, locked onto mine, and for a moment, I felt a strange sense of recognition. She wasn't a stranger. She was me. "It's time," she whispered. Her voice was soft, distant, but it felt like it was coming from inside my own mind. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I could only watch as she raised her hand, pointing to the mirror in the center of the room. The mirror, the same cracked, warped glass. And in it, I saw myself. But it wasn't me anymore. The reflection staring back at me was not my own. It was different. The eyes, they were the same, glowing, yellow, dead. The face was twisted, cracked like the mirror itself. I was no longer human. I was a part of the house. The girl stepped closer, her form solidifying, becoming more real with each step. Her lips parted, and for the first time, I heard her speak clearly. You are the house now, and the house is you. And then I understood. The house didn't just trap people. It didn't just haunt them. It absorbed them. It fed on their fears, their memories, their very essence, until there was nothing left. And then they became part of the house, part of its twisted, eternal existence. I felt myself dissolving, my thoughts, my body, my very soul being drawn into the walls, the floors, the darkness itself. There would be no escape. I was home. The girl's voice lingered in my mind, her words echoing like a twisted mantra. You are the house now, and the house is you. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. My mouth moved, my throat constricted, but no sound. It was as if the house had stolen my voice, had stolen everything. I looked back at the mirror. The reflection was clearer now, more defined, more real. My face was gone, replaced with the face of something else. Something hollow, something broken. The eyes, those eyes, glowed like two burning orbs, consuming everything in their path. I could feel the walls pressing in on me, the air growing thick, suffocating. The house was alive. I was alive within it, but not as I once was. I was part of its flesh now, part of its essence. I could feel it in my bones, in my skin. The pulse of the house was my pulse now, its breath my breath. The girl's figure flickered once more, her smile widening, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. Slowly, she took a step toward me. Welcome home, she whispered, but I knew in that instant that there was no homecoming. I had never left. I had always been here. The house had always been inside me, in my thoughts, in my blood, waiting for the right moment to pull me back, to claim me once and for all. And now it had succeeded. The house wasn't just a place. It wasn't just a building. It was alive. It fed on its inhabitants, on their fears, their despair, their very souls. It consumed them, twisted them, until they were no more than a part of its dark, eternal existence. I could feel the transformation accelerating now. The edges of my vision blurred as the room around me began to shift, to distort, to dissolve. I felt myself falling into the house itself, becoming one with it. The walls closed in. The whispers of the house, the voices grew louder until they were all I could hear, all I could feel. And then silence. For a moment, there was nothing. No house, no attic, no darkness, just stillness. And then the eyes, the countless, unblinking eyes, opened once more, staring, watching. They were everywhere, all around me. I had become them. They had become me. I was the house, and the house was me. Story 3. There was a door I never noticed before. It was a strange thing, really, because I had lived in this house for years. I knew every creak in the floorboards, every crack in the walls. It was the kind of house that became so familiar you stopped seeing it altogether. The kind of place where time seemed to bleed together and the edges of reality started to soften. But that door, I don't know how I missed it. I was in the hallway, just past the staircase, when I felt it. The coldness, a sudden drop in temperature. It wasn't from the outside, no. The air inside was thick, suffocating, like something had just shifted. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it was impossible to ignore. It was a door, but it wasn't like any of the others. The others were worn, wooden, chipped from age. This one was newer, the edges smooth and pristine, as if it had just been installed. It stood at the end of the hallway, where the light seemed to dim, as if it didn't want to touch it. I walked closer, my footsteps muffled against the thick carpet. My heart was pounding, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. It was as though the door was calling to me, pulling me toward it. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cold metal handle. It felt wrong, so wrong. But my hand stayed there, trembling, unwilling to let go. What is this? The handle turned with an ease that made my stomach twist. I should have stopped. I should have walked away, forgotten it existed. But there was something in that room, something I couldn't name, and it burned in the back of my mind. I opened the door. The room beyond it was unlike anything I had ever seen. It was small, almost cramped, and yet the moment I stepped inside, I felt an overwhelming sense of vertigo. The walls weren't walls at all, they were mirrors. Dozens of them, lined up on every surface, reflecting the space in 1,000 directions. But they weren't ordinary mirrors. The reflections were distorted, bent, as though the glass itself was alive, breathing. And there, in the middle of the room, was a chair. It was a worn leather armchair, but it looked as if it had been placed there for a purpose. A single, tall candle sat on a small table beside it, its flame flickering in an unseen breeze. The wax was melted, dripping slowly, pooling onto the table below. It gave off a faint, sickly sweet scent, something that almost made me gag. This room, what is this room? I stepped further inside, the door closing softly behind me, its faint click somehow too loud. The mirrors caught my reflection from every angle, but none of them showed me. They showed something else, something wrong. I saw myself, yes, but with every reflection, there was something different. Something I couldn't put my finger on. My eyes were darker, deeper, like pools of ink. My face was gaunt, almost skeletal. A shadow, no, a figure, stood behind me in every reflection, its face obscured by a blur, a dark smear that seemed to writhe. I backed away, my pulse quickening, but the more I moved, the more the reflections shifted. The room stretched in a way that didn't make sense, expanding and contracting like it was breathing. It's watching me. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirrors, from the figure that was growing clearer with each passing second. It was tall, too tall. Its limbs long and thin, with hands that stretched far beyond what they should. And its eyes, those eyes, they were dark, too dark, like voids that drew in the light. I reached the chair, my mind spiraling. It was as though the room itself was pulling me toward it. The figure, whatever it was, seemed to want me to sit, to join it in the madness. I could almost hear its whisper, its call, a voice that didn't come from anywhere but everywhere, wrapping around my thoughts. Sit down. My legs moved of their own accord, my body obeying without my permission. I couldn't stop myself. I sat. The moment I did, the mirrors shifted. The figure was in them, close now. Its face, a grotesque mask of distortion, loomed behind me, inches from my own reflection. I could feel it, cold and suffocating, its breath on the back of my neck. It's not a mirror anymore. It's a window. And beyond that window was something far worse than anything I had ever imagined. It wasn't a reflection. It was a door. The walls were no longer walls. The room was no longer a room. It was a gateway, a space between spaces where the boundaries of reality blurred and twisted like smoke. A place that shouldn't exist. A place where nothing existed save for the thing that stood in the corner of the room. The thing that had always been there, waiting. And it was watching me now, waiting. I was still in the chair, my body paralyzed, as if the very act of sitting had cemented me into place. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The world beyond the mirrors was closing in, but I couldn't look away. Every reflection warped and twisted around me until I was surrounded by dozens, maybe hundreds of eyes. Eyes that were not mine. The room, once small and suffocating, now felt vast, stretching endlessly into a void. The shadows were moving, shifting, growing, creeping closer to me with every blink. They were no longer just shadows. They had become something far worse. The figure in the mirror, it was almost here. I could feel it. The walls were no longer just walls. The air was growing thick, oppressive. It was suffocating me, draining the air from my lungs with every breath. The mirrors, they were more than just mirrors. They were windows, windows to a place that wasn't meant to be. I could feel its presence, behind me, beside me, everywhere. It was not just a reflection. It was part of me now, and the moment I had sat in that chair, it had become a part of the room. It had become a part of the house. I tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed whole by the empty space, absorbed by the mirrors, as if the room itself was devouring my voice. My fingers twitched, and for the briefest moment, I thought I might be able to move. But then I saw it. I saw them. In the reflection to my left, the mirror was now completely filled with eyes, dozens of dark, swirling pupils that seemed to pulse, to watch me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. They were not just watching me. They were waiting. I tried to push myself out of the chair, but it was as though the seat itself was holding me there, binding me, anchoring me to the very essence of the room. I couldn't escape. It was too late. The thought came to me, slow and inevitable, like the final page of a book you didn't want to finish but knew you had no choice. A chill ran through my spine as I realized something. The mirrors were alive. They weren't just showing me what was in the room. They were showing me what I had become. They were showing me everything I had left behind, everything I had tried to forget. I was staring into my own reflection, but it wasn't me. Not anymore. There was a darkness behind my eyes, something hollow that had begun to spread, like a sickness, corrupting everything it touched. My body was changing, shifting, as though I were becoming part of the room itself, part of the house. The door, it was still there. I could see it clearly now, through the reflections, the one that had always been there, hidden in the corner of my mind. It was waiting for me, beckoning me to step through, but I couldn't move, couldn't reach it. The house was holding me in place, its grip tightening, suffocating me. Suddenly, the reflection of the figure, the one I had seen at the corner of my eye, stepped forward, its face finally visible in the mirror. It was a face, yes, but it wasn't human. It was twisted, a grotesque parody of something once human. Its eyes were wide, hollow, staring back at me with an emptiness that felt like it was reaching into my soul. "You're mine now." The voice came through my thoughts, a whisper in my head, cold and cruel. The figure reached out, its hand passing through the glass of the mirror as if it were made of liquid, its fingers stretching toward me. And for the first time, I understood. The mirrors didn't just reflect. They pulled. They took pieces of you, drew you into their depths, until there was nothing left but an empty shell. And I had given myself to it willingly. The figure's fingers brushed my shoulder, and the room seemed to collapse around me. I was falling into the mirrors, into the darkness that had no end. I tried to scream, but there was nothing left, just the cold, suffocating silence of the house. The last thing I saw was the door, wide open now, leading into the blackness of the world beyond. I reached for it, but it was already too late. The house had claimed me. Story 4. The train was always late, but that didn't bother me anymore. It was just a part of my routine, something that had grown into the fabric of my life, like the worn seats of the train or the faint smell of damp that seemed to linger long after the rain had stopped. I took the same train every evening at the same time from the same station. It was predictable, comfortable even, but tonight felt different. I stood at the station, the cold air biting at my skin as I waited. The platform was mostly empty, as usual. A few commuters here and there, but no one I knew. I wasn't one for small talk, and everyone else seemed just as detached as I was. There was a dull hum in the air, a heaviness that made the quiet feel unnatural. And then it happened. The train arrived, or at least I thought it had. But it wasn't the usual train. This one was darker, almost sinister, as though it had emerged from the shadows themselves. The windows were black, reflecting nothing but the dim lights of the station, and the train's body seemed to hum with an unsettling energy. The doors opened without a sound. No rush, no sudden hiss like usual, just the heavy silence. I hesitated. I was used to the late trains, but this one felt wrong. It wasn't just the strange darkness that clung to it. It was something deeper, something almost alive. I could feel it tugging at my mind, drawing me toward it. The few people around me didn't seem to notice. They were all getting on, filing into the train as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. Some of them even greeted the conductor, a man standing at the door, dressed in an old-fashioned uniform, his face hidden beneath the brim of his cap. I almost turned away, but my feet moved before I could stop them, my hand reaching for the cold metal of the door. I stepped inside. The interior was dim, the usual fluorescent lights replaced by a soft, flickering glow that seemed to come from nowhere. The seats were empty, save for one at the far end of the car, where a figure sat alone. I couldn't make out the figure's face, but I could feel its eyes on me. They were watching me, waiting. I took a seat 2 rows ahead, my pulse quickening as the train began to move, gliding silently through the night. The sound of the wheels on the tracks was muffled, drowned out by a quiet hum that seemed to come from within the train itself. I tried to shake the feeling of unease, but it only grew stronger. The figure at the back of the car hadn't moved. Not once. It was as if it was waiting for something or someone. And then I noticed something else. The doors to the train were still open, but no one had gotten on after me. No one had gotten off. It was as if the train was frozen in time, stuck between destinations, with no one but me and that figure in the back. The conductor had disappeared. I should have gotten off. I should have turned around, left that train, but I didn't. And then, as the train passed through the tunnel, I heard the softest sound. A whisper, too faint to make out, came from the figure. The figure finally stood, its movements slow, deliberate. It was tall, its body too thin, and when it approached, I could see the face, or what was left of it. There was no skin, just smooth bone and hollow, empty sockets where the eyes should have been. The mouth was open, twisted into a grin that made my stomach churn. "You're the last one," it whispered, its voice hollow, like wind through dead trees. The train jolted, and I looked around. The windows had gone completely black, the night outside gone, as if we were traveling through a void. The air grew thick, suffocating. The figure was closer now, standing at the seat beside me. "Last passenger," it repeated, and as it spoke, its hands stretched toward me. Long fingers, too many joints, too many knuckles. I tried to pull away, but the seat felt like it had melted into me. The figure's hand reached for my neck, its touch cold and clammy, sending a wave of nausea through me. The grin widened, its hollow face twisting into something far worse than any nightmare. "You've been waiting too long," it murmured. "You're finally home." The train screeched to a halt. I was no longer on the train. I was in a room, dimly lit, the walls covered in cracks, the air heavy with the stench of decay. The figure was gone, but I could feel its presence all around me. It was watching me again. The door to the room opened, and I saw the conductor standing in the doorway, his face still hidden beneath the brim of his cap. "Your stop," he said, his voice low and strange. "Welcome to your final destination." I tried to speak, to scream, but the words wouldn't come. The room seemed to pulse with a rhythm of its own, the walls closing in, the air thickening. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, the door closed behind me. I was alone, but I wasn't sure anymore if I was still alive. I stood in the room, the air thick and suffocating, and every breath felt like I was drowning in something that wasn't air, something colder, darker. My skin prickled, and the sensation of being watched never left. The walls seemed to close in around me, and I instinctively took a step back. The door that the conductor had closed behind me was no longer a door. It was a solid wall, just another part of the cracked, decaying space I now found myself in. There was no handle, no way out. The windows were black, but not like the night outside. This darkness was endless, like a void that stretched into something deeper, something far worse than just the absence of light. I turned slowly, taking in my surroundings. The room was small, but the air felt vast, stretched thin. The ceiling was high, its once white paint now peeling, like the room had been forgotten for years. The floor creaked under my feet, old wood warped from time. I moved forward, cautiously, my hand resting on the edge of a rotting wooden table. It felt cold to the touch, too cold, like it had been frozen in place for a lifetime. Suddenly, I heard a sound, soft, almost imperceptible. But there, a scratching like nails on wood, and then the faintest whisper, too low for me to understand. "Is someone there?" I whispered, my voice trembling in the silence. My words felt unnatural in this place, out of place, as if the very air rejected sound. There was no answer, only that low, unsettling sound again. I had to do something. I couldn't just stand there, waiting for whatever force this was to claim me. So, I moved towards the far corner of the room. A faint light flickered, or maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. A narrow door stood there, hidden behind a rusted metal shelf filled with old jars, their contents long decayed, liquid turning black and thick. I pushed the shelf aside, ignoring the crunch of glass underfoot. The door was old, too old. Its wood was split in places, but still it looked like it had been used recently, though there was no reason for anyone to have been here, not in this forsaken place. I gripped the handle. It was ice cold, like touching metal in the dead of winter. With a creak, the door opened, revealing a narrow, dimly lit hallway. It stretched ahead of me, twisting, bending out of sight. A sharp odor hit my nose, like something decayed, something that had been left too long. I gagged, but forced myself to step forward, drawn by some strange instinct. My heart raced, but there was a quiet, calm in the air around me, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I had only taken a few steps before I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing in the corridor ahead of me. They were distant at first, but they were coming closer. The heavy footfalls, one after another, rhythmically thumping against the floor. I felt my pulse quicken. I wasn't alone. Without thinking, I moved toward the sound, a horrible curiosity pulling at me, urging me to look. Maybe, just maybe, this was an answer. Maybe this was the way out. I rounded a corner, and that's when I saw him, the conductor. He stood at the end of the hallway, facing a wall. His back was to me, and his cap, now unmistakably old and faded, still shielded his face. But there was something different about him. The air around him seemed to bend, to warp, as though he weren't quite a part of this place. The shadows seemed to gather around him, thickening, reaching out. "You should not be here," the voice came, not from him, but from all around me. It echoed in the room, in the walls, inside my skull. I froze. The words were a warning, or perhaps a truth. "Where am I?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper, lost in the expanse of the hallway. The conductor didn't turn around. His voice, when it came, was cold, empty, like the space between two stars, infinite and silent. "This is the place between places. The train never stops here," he said. His voice seemed to come from the walls, from the floor, from the air itself. "What do you mean? What is this place?" I demanded, my voice rising. "The last stop," the conductor replied, his voice echoing. "Everyone who steps aboard never leaves. Not truly. Not the way they came." I took a step back, my heart racing. "You're dead." A laugh echoed through the hall. It was soft, hollow, without humor. "No, not dead. Not alive. I have been here as long as the train. As long as the passengers. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The passengers? Who are they? Where are they? Gone, he replied. They are no longer passengers. They are part of the train now, part of the ride. I could feel it now, the cold creeping deeper into my bones, into my very soul. The walls felt like they were closing in, and I had a sudden, overwhelming urge to run. But I couldn't. My legs felt heavy, my mind clouded. The air itself seemed to pull me in, trap me, suffocate me. Why did you bring me here? I managed to croak, my throat dry. I just wanted to go home. I just wanted to get out. The train brings you where it wants you to go. The conductor's voice seemed to grow distant, like it was fading. You are already here, and you will stay as they all do, forever. I tried to move, tried to scream, but no sound came. My body refused to obey. The conductor turned slowly, his face still obscured by his cap, but something about him had changed. His form flickered like a glitch in reality, and then he was standing right in front of me. I wanted to scream, to run, but the words wouldn't come. The air was thick, as though every breath I took was pulling me deeper into the void, into the place where nothing existed except that train. I could hear it now, a distant, rhythmic sound, the wheels turning endlessly, the tracks stretching out into eternity. The conductor reached out with long, bony fingers, and I felt his cold touch on my shoulder. "Welcome to your final destination," he whispered, his breath cold against my ear. The darkness around me deepened, the shadows swallowing everything in sight. The walls closed in, and I felt myself slipping away, falling through the cracks of time and space. And then, with a jolt, the train moved again. The sound of the wheels grinding against the tracks filled my ears, louder and louder, until it drowned out everything. The shadows retreated, and I was back in the car. The lights were dim, flickering again, but I was no longer alone. There were faces now, hollow eyes staring at me from every seat, from every reflection. Faces I didn't recognize, faces that hadn't been there before. The train moved on, and I knew deep down that there was no escape. This wasn't just a train. It was a prison, a place where time was meaningless, where souls were trapped, forever lost in the darkness. The last passenger had arrived, and there would be no leaving. Story 5. I had always been drawn to the unknown. As a child, it was the dark corners of my house where my imagination roamed free, and as an adult, it manifested in my desire to explore abandoned places, lost buildings, and forgotten streets. I told myself it was a love for history, for the stories these places held, but deep down, I knew it was something more, a need to confront the darkness I could feel hiding just beyond the veil of the familiar. When I first heard about the old mansion on the outskirts of town, I didn't think twice. It was said to be haunted, but who didn't love a good ghost story? The mansion had stood there for decades, decaying, a testament to the passage of time. No one lived there anymore, but there were rumors, whispers, that the place wasn't as empty as it seemed. People said they could hear voices echoing through the halls, or see strange lights flickering behind the cracked windows at night. Others spoke of shadows moving where there should be none. I laughed it off like anyone would, but the more I heard, the more I felt compelled to go. I couldn't explain it. An itch in the back of my mind, a pull that grew stronger with each passing day. One foggy evening, with the air thick and wet, I finally stood before it. The mansion was even larger than I had imagined, looming like a beast out of a nightmare. The front gates were rusted, barely hanging on their hinges, but they opened with an unsettling creak as I pushed through. The first step onto the grounds was like stepping into another world. The air seemed heavier, saturated with a deep, unnatural silence. The grass beneath my feet felt damp and soft, but there was something wrong with the smell. It wasn't just the usual dampness of old earth. It smelled of something decayed, something long forgotten. The mansion itself was a crumbling monument to a bygone era. The once grand stone walls were now covered in ivy, and the roof sagged in places, threatening to collapse at any moment. But I was drawn inside. I had to know what secrets this place held. I reached the door. Its wood was ancient, cracked, and warped by years of neglect. I hesitated for a moment, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see if I was truly worthy of what it had to offer. But then I pushed the door open. It creaked loudly, as though it had been waiting for this moment, and I stepped inside. The air was colder than outside. The hallway stretched before me, dimly lit by the faint light coming through the cracked windows. Dust hung in the air like a fog, settling on every surface. The walls were lined with portraits, their faces faded and covered in grime. But their eyes seemed to follow me, unblinking, as though they had never left. I shivered, but pressed on, deeper into the mansion's heart. As I moved through the house, I could feel something watching me. It wasn't just the weight of the abandoned space or the oppressive silence. It was as if the house itself had a presence, something alive, something that could see me, feel me. I passed through the grand staircase hall, the stairs creaking under my weight. Every step was slow, deliberate, as though the house was testing me, warning me, daring me to go further. At the end of the hallway, I found a door, smaller than the others, tucked away in a corner. It was slightly ajar, and the soft glow of light from behind it seemed to beckon me, promising something I couldn't resist. The door opened with ease, and I stepped into a room unlike any I had seen before. It was circular, with a high-domed ceiling that seemed to swallow the light. The walls were lined with shelves, filled with old books and trinkets. A grand, ornate mirror stood in the center, its frame gilded, though tarnished with age. But it wasn't the mirror that caught my attention. It was the sound. A soft, hollow echo filled the room, as though the house itself was breathing. At first, I thought it was the wind, or perhaps a trick of the acoustics, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was as though someone or something was moving around me, stepping in time with my own movements, but always just out of sight. I turned around sharply, but there was nothing there. Just the empty shelves, the dusty floor, the mirror reflecting nothing but shadows. And then I heard it, soft whispers, just above a murmur, coming from the mirror itself. I leaned in, my heart pounding, my breath caught in my throat. "Leave before it finds you." The voice was faint, barely audible, but it was there. A warning, a plea. My hand trembled as I reached out to touch the mirror. The moment my fingers brushed the glass, the room seemed to shift. The air grew colder, heavier. The whispers grew louder, frantic now, echoing all around me. Leave now. It will never let you go. Suddenly, I heard a sound. A thump from somewhere deep within the house, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing through the halls. I turned, my breath shallow, my pulse quickening. The footsteps were coming closer. I backed away from the mirror, my mind racing. Who was there? What was in this house with me? The footsteps were louder now, closer, and I could feel the floor beneath me vibrate with each step. I wasn't alone. The whispers turned into a chant, a rhythmic, hypnotic sound that reverberated through the room, through my very bones. It sees you. It knows you. It will claim you. I turned to run, but the door I had entered through was no longer there. In its place was a wall, smooth, seamless, as though it had never existed. My heart hammered in my chest as I desperately searched for another way out. The footsteps were almost upon me, and then I saw it. In the reflection of the mirror, something moved, something that was not me. A dark figure, tall with hollow eyes, staring at me through the glass. It was there, but not there, a part of the house, a part of the air itself. I tried to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. My feet were frozen, my body betraying me. I could feel the presence behind me now, the cold breath of something unnatural on the back of my neck. The figure in the mirror raised its hand, its long fingers reaching for me. The air was suffocating, thick with dread. And then, everything went dark. I don't know how long I was unconscious, but when I woke, I was outside. The mansion loomed behind me, silent and still, as though nothing had ever happened. The fog had lifted, and the ground beneath me felt solid again. I stood up, disoriented, my body aching, and I looked around. There was no sign of the mansion, no gate, no path, no trace that it had ever existed. But I could still hear the whispers. They were in my mind, echoing, growing louder. And I knew, without a doubt, that I had never truly left. The mansion had claimed me, and its hollow echoes would follow me forever. I didn't know if I was still trapped inside, or if the house had simply let me go. But one thing was certain, the mansion was never really gone. It had only changed form, becoming something that lived inside me. And as I walked away, I could feel its cold presence pressing against my soul, always watching, always waiting. I stumbled through the foggy night, my footsteps faltering. The world around me felt warped, as though reality itself had been twisted. The mansion was gone, but the weight of it still hung heavy in the air. My mind swirled with confusion and terror, struggling to piece together what had happened. It wasn't until I reached the main road that I realized something was wrong. Something deeper than just the supernatural presence of the mansion. I tried to tell myself it was my imagination playing tricks on me, but the whispers wouldn't stop. They had followed me, clinging to the edges of my thoughts, threading through my consciousness like the faintest breeze. I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see the mansion again, its crumbling walls looming over me. But there was nothing, just the emptiness of the road stretching on, swallowed by the mist. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, something I couldn't quite see but could always feel. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. It was as though every shadow in my peripheral vision shifted. Every rustle of wind felt like a phantom breath on the back of my neck. The whispers had become clearer, more distinct now. "You can't escape it." The voice was low, almost a growl, and it seemed to emanate from all around me, curling into my ears like a whispered secret. I stopped dead in my tracks, heart racing, eyes darting around, searching for the source of the voice. But there was nothing, no one. The road was empty, the night as still as death. I tried to tell myself it was the stress, the fear, the aftermath of what had happened in that cursed house. But deep down, I knew. I knew the house hadn't let me go. It wasn't done with me, and the more I tried to ignore it, the more it began to claw at my mind. I couldn't remember how long I had been walking. Time felt like it had lost all meaning. Hours? Days? I wasn't sure anymore. The whispers were constant now, always there, growing louder, more insistent. They seemed to be seeping from my own mind, as if the mansion had somehow taken root inside of me. I began to wonder if I was still trapped in the house, still lost in its maze of corridors, its suffocating darkness. Had I truly left, or was this some twisted manifestation of the mansion's influence, playing out in the real world, bending my perception of what was true? The feeling of being watched grew stronger. It wasn't just in my mind anymore. It was physical, palpable. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as though invisible eyes were drilling into me, studying me, waiting for something. And then I saw it, a shadow darting between the trees by the side of the road. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, a product of exhaustion and fear. But then it moved again, a shape tall and thin, just at the edge of my vision, barely visible in the fog. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat, and my heart began to race faster. It was real. It was there, and I wasn't alone. I took a step back, my body trembling, my mind screaming at me to run, but my legs felt as though they had turned to stone. The shadow moved again, slowly this time, deliberately, as if it knew I was watching, as if it was toying with me. The air grew heavier, thicker, pressing down on me like an unseen force, and I could hear it, the whispering louder now all around me. "You belong to it now." The voice came from everywhere, from within me, from the world around me, from the very ground I stood on. The fog seemed to thicken, swirling around my feet like a living thing, and the shadow stepped closer, its figure becoming clearer, more distinct. It was a person, or at least it had once been. Tall, gaunt, with hollow eyes that gleamed with an unnatural light. Its skin was pale, stretched taut over its bones, and its mouth curled into a grotesque smile, one that didn't belong on a human face. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I could feel it, a presence, cold and suffocating, reaching out to me, claiming me, pulling me into its abyss. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to move, but my body was frozen, paralyzed by fear, by the weight of the thing before me. I felt the pressure in my chest, like I was suffocating, drowning in the air itself. The figure took another step toward me, and I could see its fingers, long and skeletal, reaching out, twitching with anticipation. Its mouth moved again, but no words came. It didn't need to speak. I knew what it wanted. I wanted to run, to scream, to break free, but I couldn't. I was trapped, caught between this world and the other, between reality and the horrors that haunted the house. The mansion's influence had followed me, and now it was coming to collect. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure stopped. It hovered there, just within reach, its hollow eyes burning into mine, as if waiting for me to make the next move. I don't know what happened next. One moment, I was staring into those eyes, feeling my mind unravel, and the next, everything went black. When I awoke, I was lying on the cold ground again, the fog still heavy, but the figure was gone. The whispers had faded, leaving only a quiet emptiness behind. I sat up slowly, disoriented, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had it been real, or was it just another twisted manifestation of my fear? I stood up and looked around. The road stretched out before me the same as it had before. There were no signs of the mansion, no signs of the figure. But as I began to walk again, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The weight of it, the cold, suffocating presence, lingered in the air. It was as though the mansion had left its mark on me, branding my soul with its darkness. And no matter how far I ran, no matter how far I tried to escape, I could never outrun it. And in the back of my mind, I heard the voice again. You can never escape it. I kept walking, the fog swallowing me up, knowing deep down that I had become a part of the mansion, just as much as it had become a part of me. As I stumbled forward, my mind still spinning from the encounter, I felt the fog closing in tighter around me, as if the world itself was closing its grip. The quiet had become unsettling, almost deafening. The weight of the silence seemed to press against my ears, making it harder to breathe. Every step felt like I was being pulled deeper into something I couldn't escape. I tried to steady my breathing to regain control of my thoughts. The events of the last few hours, or had it been longer, flashed in my mind like disjointed fragments. The mansion, the figure, the whispers, they all seemed to have bled together into a nightmare I couldn't wake from. I was walking now, though I wasn't sure where I was going. I didn't care. There was no destination in mind, just the desperate need to put distance between myself and the nightmare that had become my reality. But deep down, I knew it didn't matter where I went. The mansion wasn't something I could outrun. It had marked me, and no matter how far I traveled, it would always be there, haunting the corners of my mind. Suddenly, the ground beneath my feet shifted, a subtle vibration in the earth that made me freeze. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat as I strained to listen. The noise was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but then it grew louder, more distinct. A low, rhythmic thud. It was coming from behind me. I didn't need to turn around. I could already feel it, the presence, the weight of it pushing against me. The whispers returned, soft at first, like a whisper on the wind, but growing louder, clearer, until they were all I could hear. You can't escape. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, but my body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot. As the thudding grew closer, each step echoing like the beat of a death drum. The air thickened, the fog swirling around me in a vortex, until I could barely see anything. Just shapes in the mist, moving toward me, closing in. I turned slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure was there again, emerging from the fog, its tall, gaunt form twisting as if it were made of smoke. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, burning with a malicious intent. Its smile stretched wider, impossibly so, and its fingers twitched in anticipation. "You can't run from me," the figure spoke, its voice low, guttural. "You belong to me now, forever." I took a step back, my legs trembling, but I couldn't move any further. It was like I had been drawn into a web, each move I made only tightening the threads around me. The figure took another step toward me, its form flickering in and out of existence, as though it were more shadow than flesh. It was then that I realized what it was. The thing that haunted me, that whispered in my ear, that twisted my reality. It wasn't just some lingering spirit or entity. It was the mansion itself, the twisted, decaying house that had dragged me into its grasp. The figure was a manifestation of its will, its presence reaching out from the depths of my mind, pulling me back into the nightmare I had tried to escape. I wanted to scream, to fight, but the words died in my throat. I was frozen in place, my body a prisoner of my own fear. The figure's hands reached out, its long fingers curling around my wrist, and I could feel the coldness of its touch seeping into my skin, filling my veins with ice. "You belong to me," it whispered again, its voice now a cacophony of voices, all of them speaking in unison, each one colder and more insistent than the last. I tried to pull away, but it was futile. The grip on my wrist tightened, its fingers digging into my skin like talons. The fog closed in around us, and I could feel the air growing colder, heavier, as though the world was closing in on me. And then everything went still. The fog, the whispers, the thudding. All of it ceased in an instant. I was left standing there, alone in the eerie silence, still clutching my wrist where the figure's fingers had left their mark. My heart raced in my chest, but there was no sound, no movement, nothing but the heavy weight of the moment. I looked around, trying to make sense of it all, but the world had changed. The road was gone. The trees had vanished. In their place was a vast, endless void, stretching out in all directions. No sky, no ground, just a dark, oppressive emptiness that seemed to swallow everything. I realized then that I wasn't just lost in the fog. I wasn't just running away from the mansion. I had crossed into something else, something far worse. The house had reached out, pulled me into its grasp, and now it had trapped me here in this endless dark void. I couldn't escape. There was nowhere to run. I was at its mercy now, bound to the mansion's twisted will, trapped in its endless nightmare. And as the realization sank in, I heard it again, the whisper, this time clearer than ever. "You belong to me." The words echoed in my mind, filling every corner of my thoughts. There was no escape. There never would be. The mansion had claimed me, and now I was part of it, forever. Story 6. The small town of Ravenville had always been known for its picturesque landscapes and quiet charm. But there was one place that cast a long shadow over its otherwise peaceful reputation. At the edge of town, nestled between overgrown trees and shrouded in perpetual mist, stood the old Westbrook estate. To most, it was just another decaying mansion, something to be forgotten, a relic of a past that had long since faded. But to those few who still remembered, it was far from ordinary. The mansion had once been a grand music hall, where the town's elite gathered to listen to the hauntingly beautiful melodies played by a brilliant but reclusive composer named Elias Westbrook. No one knew what happened to Elias. One night, he simply vanished without a trace. The mansion, once filled with music, fell silent, and the town slowly forgot its significance. But the house, and the music that once echoed within its walls, never truly faded from the memories of those who had lived there. Whispers of strange occurrences, faint melodies drifting on the wind, ghostly figures seen at the windows, continued to circulate, though they were quickly dismissed as nothing more than superstition. It wasn't until I moved to Ravenville, searching for a quiet life away from the bustle of city living, that I first heard the rumors. I had rented a small cottage on the outskirts of town, and my neighbors, a kind elderly couple, were the ones who first mentioned the estate. "You're new to town, aren't you?" Mrs. Chapman asked, her voice soft yet filled with an eerie knowledge. "I see you walking around the old part of town. Be careful around Westbrook House, dear. There's something strange about it." First, I laughed it off. I had heard these kinds of stories before. Old houses, abandoned and forgotten, always seemed to carry a dark reputation. But Mrs. Chapman's face grew serious, her eyes darkening. "It was once filled with music," she said, almost wistfully. "Music so beautiful it could make you weep. But the night Elias disappeared, the music stopped, and it hasn't returned since." Her words stuck with me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts, and the next time I walked through the town, I found myself standing before the imposing gates of the Westbrook estate. The iron gates, though rusted and corroded by time, still held a certain elegance, as if they had once been a grand entrance to something far greater. The house itself, though decaying, still held remnants of its former glory. Tall, arched windows, a vast stone staircase leading to the grand doors. And even from a distance, I could almost hear the faintest sound, a soft, distant melody, like a haunting lullaby carried on the wind. I told myself it was nothing more than the wind, but something in the back of my mind urged me to get closer. I had always been drawn to things forgotten, to places left behind, and Westbrook House called to me like a siren's song. I didn't return to the estate that day, but the next evening, unable to shake the feeling that something was pulling me toward it, I found myself back at the gates. This time, I pushed them open with a creak that seemed to reverberate in the still air. I stepped onto the property, the overgrown grass crunching underfoot, the house looming in the distance like a dark sentinel, guarding secrets long buried. As I approached the front doors, I noticed a faint light flickering through one of the windows. Was it just the moonlight, or was there someone inside? I tried to shake off the thought, but a strange sensation crawled down my spine. I stepped inside, the door swinging open with an unsettling ease. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew filled my lungs. It had been years since anyone had set foot in this place, and yet there was something familiar about it, a feeling that this mansion, abandoned as it was, still had a life of its own. I wandered through the hallways, each room more decayed than the last. But in the very back of the house, I stumbled upon something that seemed to defy time. A grand, polished piano, its keys covered in dust but still intact. Beside it lay a small, delicate music box, the kind you might find in an antique store, adorned with intricate carvings of dancers frozen in time. It was when I touched the music box that the silence broke. The soft, eerie tune began to play, its melody familiar yet unsettling. It was the same melody I had heard earlier, carried on the wind. But now, it filled the space around me, echoing through the empty house. Each note seemed to send a shiver down my spine, and I found myself drawn to the piano, almost involuntarily. I sat at the piano, my fingers hesitating over the keys. A strange compulsion took hold of me, as though the music box had unlocked something within me. I pressed down on the first key, and instantly the house seemed to respond. The faint sound of a violin joined in, harmonizing with the piano as if the instruments were alive, playing together as one. I didn't know how I knew the melody, but somehow I did. The music flowed through me, my hands moving almost of their own accord, playing with an intensity one didn't know I possessed. But with each note, the atmosphere in the room changed. The air grew colder, heavier. Shadows danced along the walls, stretching and contorting in ways that defied logic. And then I heard it, a voice, not from anywhere in the room, but from deep within the house itself. "Don't stop. Keep playing." The voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried with it a sense of urgency, pleading, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I continued playing, my fingers pressing down on the keys with an eerie precision. The music swelled, louder now, and the shadows around me seemed to pulse with life. I tried to stop, but it was as if the music had a will of its own. My hands refused to obey, pressing down harder on the keys, the melody growing more frantic, more desperate. And then, with a sudden, deafening crash, the music stopped. I looked around, heart pounding, my breath shallow. The room was still, the piano was silent, but the air had changed. It was thick with a presence, an ancient force that seemed to surround me. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut with a violent bang, trapping me inside. The music box began to play again, but this time the melody was twisted, distorted, warped, and the voice came again, louder now, more insistent. "You shouldn't have played. You shouldn't have awakened it." The melody twisted, its notes growing darker, sharp with an otherworldly edge. Each beat seemed to vibrate through my very bones, sending shudders through my body. I turned toward the music box, the tiny figure of a dancer now spinning erratically within the glass dome. Her movements were jerky, unnatural, as though she was being forced to dance in some cruel and relentless cycle. The air felt thick, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in around me. My hands trembled, and for a moment, I thought of fleeing. But where could I go? The door had slammed shut, and the only exit was now shrouded in the same unsettling darkness that clung to every corner of the room. Then, the voice spoke again, but this time it came from everywhere. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, even the very piano beneath my fingers seemed to hum with the words. "You shouldn't have played. You've awakened us." I froze, my mind racing. Who was speaking to me? What had I awakened? I looked around, desperate to find some explanation, but all I saw were shadows. Shadows that seemed to crawl along the walls, as though they were alive, watching, waiting. The music box's melody continued, but now it wasn't alone. Other instruments joined in, strings, woodwinds, a faint chime of a bell. The sound grew louder, more overwhelming, until it felt like the room itself was vibrating with the force of it. In a panic, I tried to stop playing the piano, but my hands wouldn't obey. They moved on their own, pressing the keys with a chilling rhythm, as if they were being controlled by something outside of myself. My chest tightened, and I felt a cold sweat form on my brow. And then the voice came again. This time it was clearer, almost recognizable. "Don't you remember? We were once one. Before you sealed us away," I gasped. The realization hit me like a slap to the face, a memory long buried, clawing its way back to the surface. It wasn't just a voice. It was Elias Westbrook, the composer, the man whose music had once filled these halls, whose disappearance had been the catalyst for the house's silence. But Elias had never truly vanished. He had been trapped here, bound to the music, to the very house itself. The music surged, the violins screeching in harmony with the pounding of the piano. The shadows in the room shifted violently, and I could feel them closing in on me, their presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. A cold, clammy feeling began to spread over my skin, as if something was reaching out from the dark corners of the room to claim me. "Stop playing!" I screamed, but my voice was lost in the cacophony of sound that now enveloped me. The house seemed alive, its walls pulsing with the rhythm of the music. I tried to wrench my hands away from the piano, but they remained glued to the keys. The force was too strong. The music had me now, and I couldn't escape. And then the shadows moved. They slithered across the floor like liquid ink, pooling at my feet before rising up, their dark tendrils twisting and coiling around my legs, pulling me downward. I struggled, my heart racing, but the shadows were relentless. They were no longer just shadows, they were something else, something ancient, something that had been waiting for this moment, waiting for someone to awaken the music. Elias Westbrook had not simply disappeared. He had become part of the house, part of the music, part of the shadows. His soul had been bound to the melody, trapped in a never-ending cycle of creation and destruction. As the shadows tightened around me, I could hear his voice once more, cold and detached. "You cannot escape. The music plays on, and so do we." The walls of the room seemed to collapse inward, the shadows merging into a singular force that enveloped me entirely. I tried to scream, to break free, but my voice was swallowed by the music. The melody swelled to a deafening crescendo, and in that final, overwhelming moment, I felt my body begin to fade. The room, the house, the entire estate, it all vanished, leaving only the sound of the music playing on, unbroken, eternal. Story 7. I've always hated mirrors. There's something about them that feels wrong, something that unsettles me in a way I can't quite explain. It's not the mere presence of glass that bothers me. No, it's what happens when I look into one. It's the strange way the reflection never seems to match what I expect. And yet, I've been living with mirrors for most of my life. In every room, they hang on the walls, positioned so they catch the light just right. But no matter where I look, I can never seem to escape them. They're always there, watching, waiting. They never lie, or at least that's what they want you to think. But one night, something changed. It was late, and I had just returned home from an exhausting day. I was alone as usual. My apartment was small, dimly lit, but it was mine and it felt safe. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet as I entered the living room, my eyes scanning the space. The large mirror on the far wall caught my attention, reflecting the faint glow of the streetlights outside. I didn't think much of it at first. I never did. But as I stood there, removing my jacket and tossing it over the back of the chair, I saw someone in the reflection. It wasn't me. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe the shadows were playing games with my mind. But no, the figure standing in the reflection was not me. It was taller, leaner, with long, dark hair falling over its shoulders. The face was pale, too pale. There were dark circles beneath its eyes, and its lips were pulled into a faint, knowing smile. I froze, unable to tear my gaze away. The figure in the reflection didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, watching me with those hollow, empty eyes. My heartbeat quickened, panic creeping in at the edges of my mind. Then the figure did something that made my blood run cold. It raised its hand, and in the reflection, it reached out toward me. I stumbled back, knocking over the chair behind me in my haste to get away. The noise echoed through the room, but the figure in the mirror remained still, its hand hovering in the air, waiting. My breath came in shallow gasps as I scrambled for my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone. But when I looked back up at the mirror, the reflection had changed. Now it was me in the mirror, just as I was standing in front of the glass, panicked, confused. The reflection was calm, unnervingly calm, but I could see it. The edges of its features, its subtle movements, the way its eyes were no longer mine. I couldn't move. My legs felt like stone. My breath caught in my throat. There was no escape. The mirror wasn't just a surface. It was a portal, a gateway to something darker, something far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The figure in the reflection grinned, its smile widening. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't even a human smile. It was something cruel, something that only existed to mock and terrify. I knew then that I wasn't just seeing a reflection. I was seeing a replacement. I ran. I didn't think. I didn't know where I was going. I just had to get away, get as far from the mirror as possible. But no matter how far I ran, no matter how many rooms I crossed, the mirror followed me. It was always there, reflecting the same thing, me but not me. I finally reached the hallway and slammed the door shut behind me. I collapsed to the floor, my mind spinning, trying to make sense of the nightmare I was trapped in. The reflection, I realized, wasn't a mere trick of the light. It was alive. It was aware of me. It wanted something I didn't understand. The silence was deafening. I could hear my own breath, ragged and erratic. The world around me felt like it had shifted, like it no longer made sense. I was trapped in a twisted version of my own reality. And then I heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable. "Why are you running from me?" The voice was soft, yet it pierced through the quiet with terrifying clarity. I looked up, my eyes wide, searching the darkness. But there was no one there, just the empty hallway, just the silence. The voice came again, but this time it was closer. "You can't escape me. I'm you." I froze, the weight of the words settling over me like a suffocating blanket. No, couldn't be true. It was impossible. But the voice grew louder, more insistent, echoing through the hallway. You've always known, haven't you? That deep down we're the same. And now you can't hide from me anymore. My heart hammered in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I wanted to scream, to tear my mind away from the thoughts clawing at me, but I couldn't. It was right. The reflection wasn't just a mirror. It was a shadow of my own mind, a part of me that I had tried to bury, to ignore. But now it was coming for me, forcing me to confront the truth. It had always been a part of me, and I had pushed it aside for so long that it had grown restless. The laughter came next, soft at first, like a low chuckle, but it grew louder, more mocking. It wasn't my laughter. It wasn't my voice. And then I understood. The reflection wasn't just a mirror. It was a prison for everything I had ever hidden from myself. For all the thoughts, the feelings, the fears that I had buried so deep that they had no place in my world. But now the reflection was taking control. I felt it then, the cold, the pressure on my chest, the weight of the reflection's presence pressing down on me, pushing me toward the glass. And the last thing I saw, before everything went dark, was the reflection smiling back at me, its eyes hollow, empty, alive. Story 8. Some places are just different. You know the ones I mean, the ones that feel like they shouldn't exist, or at least not in the way you experience them. It's as if they have a history beyond the obvious, one that stretches deep into the earth, wrapping around your senses until it starts to feel like the walls are closing in. I was never one to believe in places like that. I didn't buy into the myths or the urban legends that people whispered about old houses, abandoned towns, or forgotten roads. But one night that belief was shattered. It started as a road trip, a simple, spontaneous decision to get away. A few days of solitude, a bit of quiet time to clear my head. I didn't have any particular destination in mind, just a sense of restlessness gnawing at me. It didn't matter where I went, as long as it was far enough to break the routine. I needed to disconnect, even if just for a little while. I found myself driving through a stretch of highway that was unfamiliar, a part of the country I'd never visited before. The road was winding, the trees thick and dense on either side. The air felt heavy, like a storm was coming even though the sky was clear. But there was something off, a strange pressure in the air, a sensation that my car wasn't alone on this desolate road. I shook it off at first, telling myself it was just my nerves. After all, I was alone on a long stretch of road, miles from the nearest town. It was normal to feel a little uneasy. And then I saw it, a sign that read, Hollow Creek, 5 miles. I had never heard of Hollow Creek, but the name alone intrigued me. The word hollow has a way of tugging at something inside you, a hint of emptiness that seems to echo in the back of your mind. But I kept driving, my curiosity growing. When I finally reached the town, it was, well, not exactly a town at all. There were no bustling streets, no cafes or stores, just a handful of dilapidated buildings scattered across a barren landscape. It looked abandoned, like it had been left behind for years, maybe decades. There was a single street lamp flickering at the far end of the road, the kind of light that barely illuminated anything, casting long, twisted shadows along the cracked sidewalks. It was as if the town was holding its breath, waiting for something, or someone. I parked my car near the old, rusted sign that read Hollow Creek. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decaying wood. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was unnerving. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, like the air itself was charged with something unknown. I decided to explore. The town looked too quiet, too still for my liking. The silence was overwhelming, oppressive. No birds, no animals, just the rustling of leaves and the occasional creak of a building's frame shifting in the wind. As I walked further down the street, I noticed something peculiar. The buildings, though old and neglected, seemed well maintained in a way. There were no broken windows, no shattered glass or rotting wood. Everything was intact, but everything felt wrong. It was as though the town had been frozen in time, untouched by anything, by anyone. I wandered around for a while, trying to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That's when I found it. A small, unmarked door at the back of one of the buildings. A building that looked like it hadn't been entered in decades. It was odd. The door was newer than the rest of the building, its edges sharp and pristine. No dust, no decay. Couldn't resist. Something about it called to me, urging me to open it. As I stepped closer, the door creaked slightly, but not in the way you'd expect an old door to. This was a deeper sound, as if the wood had been soaked in something dark for too long. I hesitated for a moment, but then the urge to see what was inside overwhelmed me. I pushed the door open. The room was pitch black, except for the faintest outline of something inside. I couldn't tell what it was, but the darkness felt wrong. The air inside felt thick, suffocating, like the room was holding its breath too. I took a step forward, and my foot landed on something soft. I pulled back quickly, realizing I had stepped on a small mound of dirt or soil. My heart skipped a beat. The room, if it could even be called a room, was unnaturally cold, the kind of cold that chills you from the inside out. I felt the presence of something behind me. I wasn't alone. I turned around, but the door had already shut. The heavy darkness pressed in on me, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. Something shifted at the edge of my vision, and I turned again, this time seeing the faintest movement. A shadow, taller than me, thin. It didn't have a face, just a void, a blackness that seemed to absorb the surrounding darkness. I could feel its presence creeping closer, but it wasn't until the smell hit me that I knew I was in trouble. It was the smell of damp earth, decayed wood, and something else, something metallic, like blood. I stumbled backward, but my feet wouldn't cooperate. The shadow was closing in, its form flickering in and out of view as if it was never truly there at all. My heart raced, the panic setting in as I turned again toward the door, only to find it gone, vanished. I was trapped. I could feel the shadow now, pressing against me, surrounding me. It was no longer a mere silhouette. It was alive, breathing, moving. Its cold presence seemed to crawl inside me, settling in the pit of my stomach. That's when I heard it. A whisper, faint at first, but growing louder. Leave now, before it's too late. The voice was distorted, echoing through the walls of the small, suffocating room. It wasn't mine. It wasn't human, but it was real. I turned and ran, stumbling through the thick darkness, not knowing which way to go. My breath was ragged, my chest tight as if the air itself was trying to crush me. Finally, I reached a doorway. It led outside to the dim light of the street lamp. But as I stepped out of the building, I realized Hollow Creek was gone. The town, the buildings, the very land beneath my feet had vanished. In its place was just an empty stretch of road, leading nowhere. The street lamp flickered once more, and then the world around me went black. Story 9. It's funny how we often overlook the things that are right in front of us. The small details that, in hindsight, we should have noticed. There's always something about a place, a person, or an object that we can't quite place. But it's only when it's too late that we realize how wrong everything had been all along. I remember the mirror. It was an antique, framed in dark wood with intricate carvings that I could never make out clearly, like the details were always shifting when I looked too closely. I found it at a small estate sale, tucked away in a dusty corner. It was the kind of place you only went to out of curiosity, not expecting to find anything of value, but always hoping for something intriguing, something forgotten. The mirror itself was beautiful, though. It wasn't particularly large, just enough to reflect a person's full body. But there was something haunting about it, something about the way the glass seemed to swallow the light, leaving the rest of the room in a shadowy haze. I should have known, but I didn't. I brought it home, hung it in my living room, and it became part of my daily routine. At first, it was just another decoration, one I passed by without much thought. But the longer it stayed, the more unsettling it became. At night, when the house was quiet, I'd sometimes catch myself looking at it, as if it were calling to me. The reflection would seem slightly off. Not much, just enough to make me pause. A flicker of movement in the corner of the glass, something shifting that didn't make sense. I tried to ignore it. Mirrors are just glass, right? A simple piece of furniture, nothing to get worked up over. But over time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that mirror. I began to see things in the reflection that didn't exist in the room. Shapes that moved when I wasn't looking. Figures standing just out of sight, watching me. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of something, a shadow in the corner of the mirror. But when I turned around, nothing was there. At first, I convinced myself it was just my mind playing tricks. I wasn't sleeping well, and the stress from work had been piling up. But it wasn't just that. The more I looked at the mirror, the more I started to feel observed, as if something or someone was waiting for me to make the next move. One evening, I found myself sitting in front of it, staring at my reflection. The room was dark except for the dim light from the street lamp outside, casting long shadows across the walls. I don't know why I stayed there so long, but something about the silence felt suffocating. Then I saw it. The reflection in the mirror began to move, but it wasn't me. At first, I thought it was just another trick of the light, but then it became undeniable. The figure in the mirror was real, a shadowy version of myself, standing just a few steps behind me, its features distorted, its eyes hollow and vacant. I jumped back, but the reflection didn't follow. It stood there, unmoving, its gaze fixed on me. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it, but then I saw something worse. In the reflection, my reflection's mouth, shifted into a smile. A grin that wasn't mine, too wide, too knowing. It seemed to mock me, like it had been watching me for far longer than I had realized. I turned away from the mirror and left the room, trying to push the image from my mind. But I couldn't. The image of that smile haunted me, lingering in the edges of my thoughts. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing strange noises, scraping sounds, like something was dragging across the floor or tapping softly against the walls. I lay in bed, wide awake, listening to the silence of the house. Then I heard it, a whisper, "Come back." I froze, the blood draining from my face. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried with it an undeniable command. The whisper seemed to come from everywhere, echoing in my mind, growing louder with each passing second. I wanted to ignore it, to pretend I hadn't heard anything, but I couldn't. Slowly, I got out of bed, my feet cold against the wooden floor. I didn't want to do this. I knew I shouldn't, but something inside me urged me forward. I walked into the living room, the darkness pressing in around me. The mirror was still there, hanging in the corner, its glass reflecting nothing but the empty room. But when I looked closer, I saw it again. The figure. It was standing there, just as it had before, but this time it was different. It was closer, its shadowy form reaching out toward me, its fingers stretching toward my reflection. And in that moment I realized it wasn't just a reflection. It was something else, something that had been waiting for me just beyond the glass. I couldn't move. My body was frozen, my mind screaming for me to run, to escape. But I was trapped, bound to the mirror, to that thing that wasn't me but wasn't anyone else either. The figure in the mirror grinned again, its hollow eyes staring into my soul, and I knew it wanted me. I stumbled backward, breaking free from the trance that held me. But as I turned to leave, the mirror flickered. The room around me seemed to warp, stretching and distorting, and for a moment, I was no longer sure if the world outside the glass was real, or if I had already stepped into the reflection. With a gasp, I ran from the room, slamming the door behind me. I don't know how long I stayed away, hiding in my bedroom, too terrified to go back. The whispering voice continued, calling me, begging me to return to the mirror. But I couldn't. Eventually, I packed up my things and left. I left everything behind, the apartment, the mirror. I couldn't bear to look at it again. I had to get away, to put distance between myself and whatever that thing was. But even now, as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me. I don't know where the mirror ended up, but I can't help but wonder, what if it's out there, waiting for someone else to look into it? Waiting for the next person to step inside and disappear into its reflection. Story 10. The village had always been known for its quiet solitude, nestled between thick, dense woods that seemed to stretch on forever. It was the kind of place that most people would drive through without a second thought, unaware of the secrets that lay hidden in its cobbled streets and crooked houses. A place where people came to escape, to leave their troubles behind and forget the chaos of the world beyond. I had come to this village looking for exactly that. Escape. After a painful breakup and the weight of years spent in the city, I needed a fresh start. Somewhere peaceful. Somewhere isolated. The inn was old, built long before the modern conveniences had reached this corner of the world. Its wooden beams creaked with age, and the flickering candlelight cast eerie shadows on the stone walls. The innkeeper, a gray-haired woman with sharp eyes, welcomed me with a kindness that felt almost too warm for a stranger. She told me the inn had been passed down through generations, and she herself had lived there her entire life. Nothing ever changes around here, she had said, her voice soft, almost wistful. The woods are always the same. And the lantern, well, that's a story for another time. Her words had stuck with me. The lantern? What lantern? But before I could ask further, she led me to my room, a quaint little place at the end of the hall. The windows overlooked the forest, and I could hear the wind rustling the leaves outside. It was all so peaceful, so perfect. That night, after dinner, I found myself wandering the village. The streets were deserted, and the only sound was the soft tapping of my boots against the cobblestones. The faint glow of lanterns lined the road, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and shift as I passed. But there was one lantern that stood out. It sat by the side of the village square, flickering in a way that was almost unnatural. The light was pale, casting an eerie glow on the surrounding buildings, and it seemed to pulse, as though it were alive. Curiosity tugged at me. I approached the lantern slowly, feeling a strange pull in my chest. As I neared it, the wind died down and the air grew still. The only sound was the soft hiss of the flame. I reached out, almost instinctively, and as my fingers brushed the lantern, a cold shock of energy surged through me. I gasped and stepped back, my heart racing. The air around me felt heavier, as though something unseen was watching, waiting. Then, a voice, faint but clear, whispered through the night. "Go back." I turned, heart pounding, but there was no one around. Just the empty streets and the flickering lantern. I should have left, should have walked back to the inn and forgotten all about it. But something about that lantern, the way it seemed to beckon me, kept me rooted in place. I stared at it, my breath shallow, the whisper still echoing in my mind. "Go back." The voice seemed to come from within the lantern, like it was alive, speaking directly to me. My hand moved toward it again, this time with more purpose, but before I could touch it, I saw something shift in the glass. A figure. It was barely visible at first, just a shadow flickering in the light. But then it became clearer, tall, hunched, with a face obscured by a veil of darkness. I could feel its presence, its eyes burning into mine, though I could see nothing of its features. The figure seemed to be reaching toward me, its hands stretching out through the glass, like it was trying to break free. My legs froze. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. Then, the figure's voice joined the whisper, low and guttural. "Leave now." The lantern flickered wildly, its flame dancing like a furious storm. I stumbled back, heart hammering, my mind scrambling for reason. But there was no explanation, no way to make sense of what I was seeing. It was like the village itself had come alive, pulling me deeper into its dark secrets. I ran, not stopping until I was back at the inn. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my skin was cold with sweat. I slammed the door behind me and locked it, the strange energy of the lantern still pressing against my chest. I tried to sleep, but the whispering voice followed me into my dreams. It was soft at first, just a murmur at the edge of my consciousness. But as the night wore on, it grew louder, more urgent. "Go back." I woke in a cold sweat, my sheets tangled around me. The room was silent, but I could still feel the pull of the lantern in my chest, like an invisible thread tying me to the village. The next morning, I told the innkeeper about what had happened. She listened quietly, her eyes darkening as I spoke. "Ah," she said, her voice heavy with regret. "You found the lantern." I nodded, unsure of what to say. Her expression was unreadable, but I could feel the weight of her words, as though she were reliving something painful. She paused before continuing. "You should have listened to the voice, my dear. The lantern, it's not just a light. It's a warning, a curse, if you will. It's been here for longer than anyone can remember. And the figure you saw, it's the keeper. It has chosen you, just as it has chosen others before." I stared at her, trying to comprehend what she was saying. "Chosen? What do you mean? What happens if I don't?" Her face grew somber. "If you don't leave, if you don't heed its warning, it will take you. Slowly, surely, it will drag you into the lantern, into the darkness." I didn't need her to explain any further. I understood. The figure had wanted me, and now it was only a matter of time before it would come for me again. I didn't stay another night. I packed my things and left the inn, driving away from the village as fast as I could, my mind reeling with the knowledge that whatever I had encountered there, whatever that lantern had been, would never truly leave me.